In the opulent halls of Haverford Manor, a priceless antique lamp vanishes from a locked parlour, plunging the household into a web of suspicion. Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and quiet wisdom, unravels the secrets of 4 suspects: a charming gambler drowning in debt, an ambitious decorator with late-night secrets, a butler bearing a hidden burden, and a collector consumed by obsession. A scuff mark, a shard of sapphire glass, and a trail of human frailties led her to the truth. Will she expose the thief before the manor's secrets unravel further? Dive into a mystery where every glance hides a clue, and every heart a motive. Chapter 1. The Disappearance. The morning sun crept through the tall mullioned windows of Haverford Manor's parlour, its rays splintering into soft beams that danced across the polished mahogany surfaces. The room was a testament to refined taste, its walls adorned with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow every movement. A Persian rug, rich with crimson and gold, muffled footsteps, while shelves groaned under the weight of curios from distant lands. Ivory carvings from India, porcelain from China, and most striking of all, an antique lamp on a rosewood side table. Its stained glass shade, a mosaic of sapphire and emerald, glowed like a jewel, casting delicate patterns on the nearby damask curtains. It was, as Lady Beatrice Haverford often boasted, the crown of her collection. A relic rumoured to have once graced a Parisian salon in the late Victorian era. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a high-backed armchair upholstered in faded brocade, held a delicate porcelain teacup, its warmth soothing her arthritic fingers. Her visit to Haverford Manor was a rare departure from the quiet routines of St. Mary Mead, prompted by a letter from Lady Beatrice, an old-school friend whose penchant for lavish gatherings had not dimmed with age. Miss Marple, with her neat grey hair and unassuming tweed, seemed an unlikely guest among the manor's glittering company. Yet her presence was welcomed with the warmth reserved for those whose quiet wisdom belies their modest appearance. She sipped her tea, her clear blue eyes taking in every detail of the room, from the intricate plasterwork on the ceiling to the faint creak of the floorboards under a passing servant. The tranquillity shattered when Lady Beatrice swept into the parlour, her silk dress rustling like autumn leaves. Her face, usually composed with aristocratic poise, was flushed with distress. "Jane!" she exclaimed, her voice a sharp note above the morning's calm. "It's gone! My lamp! The antique lamp! It's vanished!" She gestured toward the rosewood table, now conspicuously bare, its polished surface reflecting only the morning light. The absence of the lamp was as jarring as a missing tooth in a perfect smile. Miss Marple set her teacup down with deliberate care, her expression serene, but her mind already stirring. "Vanished, you say?" she asked, her voice soft but precise. "When was it last seen?" "Last night at dinner," Lady Beatrice replied, wringing her hands. "It was there, glowing as always. I locked the parlour myself at 11, as I always do when we have guests. This morning it was gone." Her voice rose, drawing the attention of a housemaid polishing a silver candelabra in the corner. The girl's eyes widened, and she scurried out, no doubt to spread the news below stairs. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt, and approached the empty table. The room, though grand, felt suddenly vulnerable, as if the theft had stripped away its invincibility. She noted the locked windows, their heavy latches untouched, and the door, sturdy oak with a key, Only the butler, Mr. Grayson, held overnight. The parlour was a fortress, yet someone had breached it. No signs of forced entry, she murmured, almost to herself. Curious. Lady Beatrice clutched her arm. Jane, you must help. You've a knack for these things. I've heard of your little inquiries in St. Mary Mead. The police would only make a fuss, and I can't bear the scandal. Not with guests here. Her eyes darted to the doorway where the murmur of voices from the breakfast room drifted in. Miss Marple patted her friend's hand, her smile reassuring, but her mind already dissecting the problem. A theft in a locked room, in a house full of strangers and trusted servants, was no simple matter. She thought of a burglary in her village years ago, where a silver teapot vanished from a locked vicarage. The culprit, a trusted choir boy, had hidden it in a hymn book, driven by a childish whim. This, she sensed, was no whim. The lamp was valuable, unique, and coveted. Its theft required motive, opportunity, and nerve. I'll observe, Beatrice, Miss Marple said gently. People talk, you know, and they reveal more than they intend. Let us have breakfast with your guests. I'll listen, and we shall see what comes to light. Lady Beatrice nodded, relief softening her features. As they left the parlour, Miss Marple glanced back at the empty table, her mind cataloguing the room's details. The faint dust on the table's edge, undisturbed. The heavy curtains, unmoved. The polished floor, gleaming but for a single faint scuff mark near the table's base. It was a small thing, that mark, but Miss Marple knew small things often unravelled great mysteries. She followed Lady Beatrice to the breakfast room, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, ready to unravel this one, thread by thread. Chapter 2. The Household. The breakfast room at Haverford Manor was a study in restrained grandeur, its long oak table set with gleaming silver and fine bone china, the air scented with the faint aroma of freshly baked scones and strong coffee. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating a tapestry of pastoral scenes that hung above a marble fireplace. The room buzzed with the subdued chatter of guests, their voices mingling with the clink of cutlery, and the soft tread of servants moving with practised efficiency. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the end of the table, appeared absorbed in buttering a piece of toast. But her keen eyes missed nothing. The disappearance of the antique lamp had cast a subtle pall over the gathering, though most pretended otherwise, their conversation skimming the surface of weather and weekend plans. Miss Marple, however, was attuned to the undercurrents, the sidelong glances, the forced laughter, the silences that spoke louder than words. Lady Beatrice, at the head of the table, maintained a brittle cheer, her smile as fragile as the porcelain teacup she held. She had insisted on proceeding with breakfast as usual, determined to avoid a spectacle, but her frequent glances toward the parlour door betrayed her unease. Miss Marple, nibbling her toast, observed the assembled company, her mind cataloguing each figure with the precision of a village gossip piecing together a scandal. The suspects, as she saw them, were four: the butler, the guest, the decorator, and the collector. Each carried their own secrets, their own reasons to covet the lamp, or to wish it gone. Mr. Harold Grayson, the butler, moved about the room, with the silent authority of a man who had served Haverford Manor for 3 decades. His black suit was immaculate, his grey hair combed with military precision, but there was a stiffness to his movements, a tension in the set of his jaw that Miss Marple found telling. She recalled a grocer in St. Mary Mead, a man of similar demeanour, whose rigid propriety masked a private sorrow, a wayward son, debts unpaid. Grayson poured coffee with steady hands, but when a guest asked for more cream, his response was curt, almost sharp. Miss Marple noted it, her knitting needles clicking softly in her lap, a rhythm that helped her think. Across the table sat Mr. Lionel Trent, Lady Beatrice's distant cousin, a man in his late 30s whose boyish charm was tempered by a certain world-weariness. His tailored blazer and silk tie spoke of wealth, but the cuffs were slightly frayed, and his smile, though dazzling, had a practised quality. He was regaling a young lady with tales of his travels. Monte Carlo, Biarritz, a fleeting mention of a yacht in the Mediterranean. But his eyes flicked nervously toward Lady Beatrice whenever the conversation paused. Miss Marple knew of Trent through village gossip that had reached her years ago. A gambler, they said, whose luck ran as hot and cold as a country summer. His presence at the Manor, ostensibly for a family reunion, felt convenient. Could a man in debt resist the lure of a valuable lamp? She sipped her tea, watching him laugh too loudly at his own jest. Mrs. Clara Dupont, the decorator, was a striking woman in her early 40s, her auburn hair pinned in a severe chignon that contrasted with the softness of her silk blouse. She had been hired to refresh the Manor's interiors, a task that brought her into intimate contact with its treasures. She spoke little, her attention fixed on her plate, but her fingers toyed with a silver spoon, twisting it in a rhythm that suggested distraction. When Lady Beatrice mentioned the lamp's disappearance in passing, Mrs. Dupont's head snapped up, her green eyes narrowing for a fraction of a second before she murmured something about the tragedy of losing art. Miss Marple thought of a seamstress in her village, a woman whose ambition outstripped her means, who once borrowed a bolt of silk to impress a client. Ambition, Miss Marple knew, could drive one to desperate acts. Mr. Reginald Voss, the collector, was the most animated of the group, his thin frame practically vibrating with enthusiasm as he described a recent auction in London. His pince-nez glasses perched precariously on his nose, and his hands gestured wildly, knocking over a salt cellar which he righted with an apologetic chuckle. His passion for antiques was evident, his knowledge encyclopedic, but there was something feverish in his manner, a hunger that went beyond scholarly interest. He had spoken of the lamp at dinner the previous night, calling it a singular piece unmatched in craftsmanship, his voice trembling with reverence. Miss Marple remembered a St. Mary Mead recluse, a man who hoarded rare books not to read them, but to possess them, locking them away from the world. Voss's eyes, she noted, had the same glint. As breakfast progressed, Miss Marple let the conversation flow around her, her unassuming presence allowing her to fade into the background. She listened as Lady Beatrice deflected questions about the lamp, her voice bright but strained. "Oh, it's likely a misunderstanding," she said, waving a hand. "Perhaps it's being cleaned." But her eyes met Miss Marple's, pleading for discretion. The other guests, minor gentry, a retired colonel, a novelist with a penchant for melodrama, offered sympathy or speculation, but none seemed overly concerned. The lamp to them was merely one of many treasures in a house brimming with wealth. To the thief, however, it was something more. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a young footman who approached Grayson with a whispered message. The butler's face tightened, and he excused himself, his departure swift but controlled. Miss Marple's needles paused. A butler's duties were many, but such urgency suggested something amiss. She made a mental note to inquire later, perhaps through the housemaids, who are often more forthcoming than their superiors. She turned her attention to Mr. Trent, who was now charming the novelist with a story of a Parisian card game that had nearly cost him his watch. His laughter was infectious, but Miss Marple noticed his left hand, resting on the table, bore a faint ink stain, a detail that struck her as odd for a man so fastidious in appearance. In St. Mary Mead, a local clerk had once betrayed his theft of church funds by the ink on his fingers, a habit from forging receipts. Was Trent writing letters, perhaps to creditors, or something else? Mrs. Dupont, meanwhile, had excused herself to fetch a notebook, claiming she needed to review fabric samples for the drawing-room. Her absence was brief, but Miss Marple noted the way she glanced at the parlour door as she returned, her expression unreadable. The decorator's work gave her access to every corner of the manor, including the parlour. Had she lingered there last night, under the guise of measuring curtains? Miss Marple recalled a maid's off-hand remark about Mrs. Dupont working late, adjusting drapes long after the household had retired. Mr. Voss, oblivious to the undercurrents, launched into a monologue about a Venetian chandelier he'd once bid on, his voice rising with excitement. "The artistry of the past is unparalleled," he declared, his glasses slipping as he leaned forward. "Modern pieces lack soul." Miss Marple smiled politely, but her mind was elsewhere. Voss's fervour was genuine, but it bordered on obsession. She thought of a village carpenter who carved intricate boxes, not for sale, but for himself, hiding them in his attic. Could Voss's passion have driven him to take the lamp, not for profit, but for private adoration? The meal drew to a close, and the guests dispersed, some to the gardens, others to the library or their rooms. Miss Marple lingered, offering to help Lady Beatrice with a minor task, a pretext to stay near the breakfast room and observe the servants. She approached a young housemaid, Ellen, who was clearing plates. "A dreadful business about the lamp," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle, inviting confidence. Ellen, a rosy-cheeked girl with a nervous habit of twisting her apron, nodded. "It was there at dinner, miss, I swear it. I dusted the table myself before locking up." "And Mr. Grayson locked the parlour?" Miss Marple asked, her voice as mild as if she were discussing the weather. "Oh, yes, miss, he always does. It's the only key, far as I know." Ellen hesitated, then lowered her voice. "He's been a bit off lately, though, snappish-like. Not his usual self." Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic, but her mind racing. A butler's distress could stem from many causes: illness, family troubles, or something closer to home. She thanked Ellen and moved toward the parlour, her steps slow but purposeful. The room was as she'd left it, the empty table a silent accusation. She examined it again, noting the absence of fingerprints in the faint dust, a sign the thief had been careful. The scuff mark on the floor, narrow and precise, suggested a deliberate step, not the careless tread of a servant. She knelt, her knees protesting, and studied it closely. It was fresh, likely made last night, and its shape hinted at a dress shoe. not the sturdy boots of the staff. Rising, she turned her attention to the windows. They were latched, the sills free of dirt or scratches that might indicate an intruder. The door's lock was intact, its mechanism smooth. Only someone with a key, or the skill to pick it, could have entered without force. She thought of Grayson's key, but also of the guest's access to the house. Trent, with his restless energy, might have wandered at night. Dupont, with her late-night work, had opportunity. Voss, with his knowledge of locks, she recalled him mentioning a youthful apprenticeship to a locksmith, could have managed it. Even Grayson, despite his loyalty, might have been tempted by a pressing need. Miss Marple returned to her seat, her knitting resumed, but her thoughts were far from idle. The household was a microcosm, much like St. Mary Mead, where secrets bubbled beneath the surface of polite society. Grayson's tension, Trent's debts, Dupont's ambition, Voss's obsession, each was a thread in a tangled skein. She considered the lamp itself, not merely valuable, but unique, its craftsmanship a magnet for desire. In her village, a stolen brooch had revealed a maid's jealousy, a missing letter, a vicar's indiscretion. Here the stakes were higher, the players more complex. As she knitted, a pattern emerged in her mind, not of wool, but of motives and opportunities. Grayson, with his key and his burdens, was unlikely to risk his position for a single theft, but his unease warranted watching. Trent's charm masked desperation, but his carelessness made a meticulous theft unlikely. Dupont's access and ambition were compelling, yet her demeanour suggested caution, not daring. Voss, however, burned with a collector's zeal, a passion that could override morality. His knowledge, his fervour, his presence in the house, all pointed to him, yet Miss Marple knew better than to leap to conclusions. She rose, tucking her knitting into her bag, and resolved to speak to each suspect in turn. People, she knew, revealed themselves in conversation, their words betraying what their faces concealed. The Manor was a stage, its players performing their roles, but Miss Marple was no mere audience. She would watch, listen, and in time uncover the truth behind the vanished antique lamp. Chapter 3. The Parlour's Secrets. The parlour of Haverford Manor, bathed in the soft glow of late morning, seemed to hold its breath as Miss Jane Marple stepped inside, her footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rug. The room, with its high ceilings and heavy velvet drapes, exuded an air of solemn dignity, as if aware of its own importance in the unfolding drama. The empty rosewood table, where the antique lamp had once stood, was a silent accusation, its polished surface reflecting the chandelier's prisms in a mockery of the missing treasure. Miss Marple closed the door behind her, ensuring privacy, and let her eyes roam the space with the quiet deliberation of one accustomed to finding truth in the overlooked. She had excused herself from the breakfast room, claiming a need to rest her eyes, a pretext that allowed her to slip away unnoticed. Lady Beatrice, still shaken, had agreed to keep the other guests occupied with a tour of the Manor's rose garden, giving Miss Marple the solitude she needed. The parlour was locked each night, as Lady Beatrice had confirmed, with Mr. Grayson holding the only key. Yet the lamp was gone, and the absence of forced entry suggested a thief who moved with purpose and guile. Miss Marple, her hands clasped behind her back, began her inspection, her mind as sharp as the needles in her knitting bag. The windows, tall and framed in oak, were her first focus. Their latches were secure, the brass gleaming from recent polishing. She pressed a finger to the sill, finding no trace of dirt or disturbance, no smudges, no scratches, no telltale signs of an outsider's entry. The glass was cool under her touch, the panes unmarred. An intruder from outside would have left some marks, she reasoned, recalling a burglary in St. Mary Mead, where a broken twig on a windowsill had betrayed a clumsy thief. Here the windows were innocent, their silence pointing to a culprit within the manor's walls. She turned to the door, its heavy oak unyielding. The lock, a sturdy mechanism of Victorian design, showed no signs of tampering, no scratches on the keyhole, no splintered wood. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. A picked lock required skill, patience, or a key. Mr. Grayson's key was the obvious answer, but she hesitated to assume his guilt. In her village, a postmistress had once been blamed for missing letters, only for the culprit to be revealed as a neighbour with a duplicate key made in secret. Could someone else have access to a copy? Or had the lock been bypassed by other means? Her gaze fell to the floor, where the scuff marks she had noticed earlier caught the light. A faint crescent-shaped blemish on the polished oak just beside the rosewood table. She knelt, ignoring the protest of her knees, and examined it closely. The mark was fresh, its edges sharp, not yet softened by the tread of passing feet. It was narrow, no wider than the heel of a gentleman's dress shoe, and angled as if someone had pivoted carefully while standing by the table. Not the broad, practical sole of a servant's shoe, nor the soft slipper of a lady like Mrs. Dupont. Miss Marple's mind flickered to the suspects. Mr. Trent's polished brogues, Mr. Voss's narrow loafers, Mr. Grayson's sturdy boots. The mark was a clue, small but significant, like the stray thread that had once led her to a pilfered purse in St. Mary Mead. Rising, she approached the rosewood table itself. The surface was pristine, save for a faint ring of dust where the lamp's base had rested, undisturbed by smears or fingerprints. The thief had lifted the lamp straight up, not dragged it, a sign of care that suggested familiarity with its weight and value. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. A hasty thief, Mr. Trent perhaps driven by debt, might have left smudges or knocked over nearby objects. The table held a small crystal vase and a silver cigarette case, both untouched. This was no impulsive act, but a calculated one. She circled the room, her steps deliberate, noting the arrangement of furniture. A wingback chair stood near the fireplace, its cushions slightly askew, as if someone had sat there recently. A low bookshelf held leather-bound volumes, their spines aligned but one book, a treatise on French glasswork, tilted slightly forward, as if hastily replaced. Miss Marple pulled it out, flipping through its pages, but found nothing hidden within. Still, the book's subject matter struck her. The lamp's stained glass shade was French, or so Mr. Voss had claimed at dinner. Had he lingered here, studying it? She returned the book, her mind filing away the detail. The curtains, heavy and green as a forest, hung undisturbed, their folds pristine. Miss Marple parted them slightly, checking for hidden spaces or signs of movement, but found none. The fireplace, cold and swept clean, offered no clues, no ash scattered, no charred remnants of a clumsy attempt to destroy evidence. The room was a fortress, its secrets locked within its walls, yet the lamp had vanished as if by magic. Miss Marple paused, her hands resting on the back of a chair, and let her thoughts settle. The parlour's secrets were not in its grandeur, but in its subtleties, the scuff mark, the dust, the tilted book. She recalled a St. Mary Mead incident, where a stolen locket was found because of a smudged mirror, unnoticed by all but her. Here the clues were few, but they whispered of a thief who knew the house, the lamp, and the value of silence. She decided to question Mr. Grayson first, his role as keeper of the key making him central to the puzzle. She found him in the butler's pantry, polishing a set of silver spoons with a cloth that moved in precise, almost mechanical strokes. His face, lined and serious, betrayed no emotion, but his eyes flicked to her with a wariness that belied his composure. "Good morning, Mr. Grayson," Miss Marple said, her voice as gentle as a summer breeze. "A troubling business, this lamp." "Indeed, miss," he replied, his tone clipped. "A great loss to her ladyship. You locked the parlour last night, I understand." She tilted her head, her expression one of polite curiosity. "At midnight, as always." His hands paused, then resumed polishing. "The lamp was there when I checked. I saw it myself." "And no one entered after?" she pressed, her tone unchanged. "Not to my knowledge, miss. The key stays with me." He patted his waistcoat pocket, where a faint jingle confirmed the key's presence. Miss Marple nodded, her smile disarming. "The floor, Mr. Grayson, beautifully polished. But there's a small mark near the table. A scuff, I think. Have you noticed it?" His fingers tightened on the yell. Spoon, a movement so slight it might have gone unseen by anyone less observant. "A scuff, miss? The maids must have missed it. I'll have it seen to." His voice was steady, but his eyes avoided hers. "No trouble," she said lightly. "These things happen. You've much to manage, I'm sure." She thanked him and left, her mind turning over his reaction. Grayson was loyal, but loyalty could bend under pressure. In St. Mary Mead, a gardener had once sold a rare plant to cover a sick child's bills, his guilt betrayed by a trembling hand. Grayson's tension was similar, but whether it stemmed from guilt or mere strain, she could not yet say. She sought out the housemaids next, finding Ellen in the linen room, folding napkins with quick, nervous hands. The girl's eyes widened at Miss Marple's approach, but she relaxed under the older woman's gentle smile. "Ellen, dear," Miss Marple began, "you dusted the parlour yesterday, didn't you?" "Yes, miss," Ellen said, twisting her apron. "Before dinner, like always. The lamp was there, shining lovely. And after dinner, did you see anyone near the parlour?" Ellen hesitated, glancing at the door. "Well, miss, I saw Mrs. Dupont there, late-like. She was measuring the curtains, she said. Near 10 o'clock it was." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. 10 o'clock? Rather late for such work. "She said it was urgent, miss. For her plans?" Ellen's voice dropped. "But she seemed, I don't know, jumpy." Miss Marple thanked her, her mind adding this to the tapestry of clues. Mrs. Dupont's presence in the parlour, so close to the time of the theft, was no coincidence. Yet the scuff mark, the careful lifting of the lamp, suggested a plan more deliberate than a decorator's impulse. The parlour's secrets were beginning to speak, but their message was still faint, like a whisper in a storm. As she returned to the main hall, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the suspects. Grayson's key and his unease, Trent's debts and restless charm, Dupont's late-night wanderings, Voss's fevered passion, all were pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit neatly. The parlour, with its locked door and silent clues, held the truth, but it would require patience to coax it out. She adjusted her shawl, her eyes bright with purpose, and resolved to speak to Mr. Trent next. People, she knew, were like parlours, full of secrets waiting to be unlocked. Chapter 4. The Guest's Tale. The gardens of Haverford Manor were a riot of colour, their rose bushes heavy with blooms and their paths lined with neatly trimmed boxwood hedges. The late morning air carried the scent of lavender and freshly turned earth, a contrast to the tension that lingered within the manor's walls. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat shielding her eyes from the sun, strolled along a gravel path, her arm linked with that of Mr. Lionel Trent. The invitation for a walk had been her own, offered with the gay, disarming charm of an elderly aunt seeking company, and Trent, ever the gallant, had accepted with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. To the casual observer, they were merely a guest and his cousin's friend enjoying the gardens, but Miss Marple's purpose was far from idle. She meant to unravel the tale of Lionel Trent, whose charm and debts made him a figure of interest in the mystery of the vanished lamp. Mr. Trent, in a linen suit that was impeccably tailored but betrayed a faint crease at the elbows, walked with the easy grace of a man accustomed to pleasing others. His dark hair was swept back, his features boyishly handsome, though a faint shadow beneath his eyes hinted at sleepless nights. He spoke of the roses, comparing their hues to the sunsets of Biarritz, his voice light and engaging. Miss Marple listened, her expression one of polite interest, but her mind was elsewhere. Sifting through the details she had gathered, the scuff mark in the parlour, the locked door, the careful theft. Trent, with his rumoured gambling debts, was a man who might see a valuable lamp as a solution to pressing troubles. "You've travelled widely, Mr. Trent," she said, pausing to admire a cluster of pink roses. "It must be a delight to visit such places. Monte Carlo, I believe you mentioned at breakfast." He flashed a grin, the kind that had likely opened many doors. "Oh yes, Monte Carlo's a whirl of excitement. The casinos, the sea air, it's intoxicating. But I'm just as happy here, with Beatrice's hospitality." His tone was smooth, but his fingers toyed with a cufflink, a silver piece engraved with a monogram, its edge chipped as if from careless handling. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on the roses, but her attention on his hands. "It must be costly, such travels," she remarked, her voice as gentle as a breeze. "I've a nephew who fancies cards, you know, always talking of stakes and winnings, though I confess it worries me. Young men can be reckless." Trent's laugh was quick, a shade too loud. "Reckless? Not I, Miss Marple. I play for sport, not ruin. A gentleman knows his limits." But his eyes darted to the manor, and she noted the way his shoulders tensed, as if her words had brushed a nerve. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had known a young man, a solicitor's clerk, whose gambling had led him to pawn a client's watch, his charm masking desperation until a stray receipt betrayed him. Trent's manner was similar, polished but with cracks. The ink stain on his finger, noticed at breakfast, lingered in her mind. Was he writing letters to creditors, pleading for time, or something more clandestine? They paused by a stone bench, and Miss Marple sat, gesturing for him to join her. "This business with the lamp," she said, folding her hands in her lap. "It's quite peculiar, don't you think? A locked room, no signs of a break-in. I wonder what sort of person could manage such a thing." Trent leaned back, crossing one leg over the other, his posture relaxed but his eyes wary. A clever one, I'd wager, or someone with a key. Grayson, perhaps. Butlers always know more than they let on. He chuckled, but it lacked warmth. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, her tone thoughtful. Though it would be bold for a man of his position. And the lamp, such a specific choice. Not easily sold, I imagine, unless one knew the right people. She let the words hang, watching his reaction. His smile faltered just for a moment before he recovered. Oh, I wouldn't know about that. I'm no collector. Antiques are Beatrice's passion, not mine. I prefer things I can spend. Wine, good company, a night at the tables. He stood, offering his arm. Shall we continue? The air's too fine to linger on thefts and mysteries. Miss Marple took his arm, her smile as mild as ever, but her mind was busy. Trent's deflection was practiced, his casual dismissal of the lamp too quick. She thought of the scuff mark in the parlour, made by a narrow shoe. Trent's brogues, polished to a shine, fit the description, but so did Mr. Voss's loafers. And Trent's debts, whispered about in society circles, gave him motive. Yet the theft's precision, the undisturbed dust, the lack of fingerprints, suggested a care he might not possess in his current state of strain. As they walked, Miss Marple steered the conversation to the previous night. "You were at dinner, of course," she said. "The lamp was quite striking, wasn't it? All those colours in the glass. I noticed you admiring it." "Did I?" Trent's brow furrowed, as if trying to recall. "I suppose it was pretty enough. Voss was the one going on about it. French glass, Victorian something or other. He's the expert, not me." He waved a hand, dismissing the topic, but his fingers brushed the chipped cufflink again, a nervous habit. Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged. Trent's denial was plausible, but his unease was not. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead's shopkeeper, caught stealing from the till, whose lies were betrayed by a twitch of the mouth. Trent's gestures were subtler, but no less telling. Had he been in the parlour after dinner, perhaps under the guise of a late-night stroll? His room was on the ground floor, near the east wing, not far from the parlour's entrance. Opportunity was there, but the means, access to a locked room, remained a question. They reached the end of the garden path, where a fountain bubbled, its spray catching the sunlight. Miss Marple paused, ostensibly to admire it, but her mind was elsewhere. "You must find these country weekends restful," she said, "after all your adventures. Though I imagine you're up late, like my nephew, writing letters or planning your next trip." Trent's laugh was strained. "Letters? Hardly. I'm not one for paperwork. And last night I was in bed by 11, dead to the world. Too much of Beatrice's claret, I'm afraid." He grinned, but his eyes avoided hers, focusing instead on the fountain. Miss Marple smiled, her thoughts sharpening. His alibi was convenient, unverifiable unless a servant had seen him. And the ink stain, small but persistent, suggested he had been writing, despite his claim. She thought of a letter found in St. Mary Mead, crumpled in a bin, that had revealed a blackmail scheme. Could Trent have been writing to someone about the lamp, perhaps arranging its sale? Or was the stain a red herring, like the misplaced glove that had once misled her in a village theft? As they turned back toward the manor, Miss Marple's questions multiplied. Trent's charm was a shield, but it was not impenetrable. His debts, his presence, his nervous gestures, all pointed to a man under pressure. Yet the theft's meticulous nature did not align with his apparent recklessness. A gambler might act on impulse, but the lamp's removal required planning. She needed more. Perhaps a conversation with the housemaids who might have seen Trent moving about last night, or a closer look at his belongings for signs of ink or glass. "Thank you for the walk, Mr. Trent," she said as they reached the Manor's steps. "You've been most kind to an old woman." "My pleasure, Miss Marple," he replied, bowing slightly. "You're sharper than most, I'll wager. Beatrice is lucky to have you poking about." His tone was light, but his eyes held a flicker of caution, as if he sensed her scrutiny. Miss Marple smiled and excused herself, her mind already turning to the next thread in the tapestry. Trent was a player in this game, but whether he was the thief or merely a man with secrets, she could not yet say. The parlour's clues, the scuff mark, the dust, the locked door, pointed to a careful hand, and Trent's was not the only one in question. She resolved to speak to Mrs. Dupont next. The decorator whose late-night work in the parlour raised its own suspicions. As she entered the Manor, her knitting bag swinging lightly at her side, Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of a puzzle unfolding, its pieces waiting to be fitted together by her patient, unerring hand. Chapter 5. The Decorator's Motive. The drawing-room of Haverford Manor was a symphony of elegance, its pale blue walls adorned with gilded mirrors, and its furniture draped in fabrics that whispered of expense. Mrs. Clara Dupont, the decorator tasked with refreshing the Manor's interiors, stood amidst a flurry of swatches, her auburn hair catching the afternoon light as she adjusted a cushion on a velvet settee. Her movements were precise, almost theatrical, as if she were staging a scene for an unseen audience. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a corner with her knitting, observed her quietly, her needles clicking in a steady rhythm that belied the sharpness of her scrutiny. The disappearance of the antique lamp had cast a shadow over the household, and Mrs. Dupont, with her late-night presence in the parlour, was a figure of interest in Miss Marple's unfolding investigation. Miss Marple had sought out Mrs. Dupont under the guise of admiring her work, complimenting the new damask curtains that framed the drawing-room's windows. "Such a gift you have," she said, her voice warm and encouraging, "to bring life to a room. It must be a challenge, working with treasures like Lady Beatrice's lamp." Mrs. Dupont's green eyes flicked up from her swatches, a momentary tightening of her lips betraying her surprise. "The lamp," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "It was beautiful, of course, but not quite suited to my vision for the parlour. Too ornate, perhaps." She smoothed a piece of silk, her fingers lingering on its texture as if to steady herself. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of innocent curiosity. "I suppose you're right. Modern tastes lean toward simplicity, don't they? Still, it's a pity it's gone missing. You were in the parlour last night, I understand, measuring curtains." Her question was gentle, almost offhand, but her eyes missed nothing. Mrs. Dupont's hand paused, the silk slipping slightly in her grasp. "Yes, I was," she admitted, her voice steady but her gaze averted. "I often work late. The quiet helps me focus. I was measuring for new drapes. Lady Beatrice wants a lighter fabric to brighten the room." She met Miss Marple's eyes then, her smile polite but strained. "I didn't see the lamp, I'm afraid. My mind was on my work." In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had known a dressmaker whose ambition led her to borrow a client's brooch for a society event, her excuses as polished as Mrs. Dupont's. Ambition, Miss Marple knew, could be a powerful motive, especially for a woman like Mrs. Dupont, whose decorating business was still establishing itself in the competitive world of high society. A rare piece like the lamp could fetch a sum to secure her reputation, or cover debts incurred in building it. They moved to a table where Mrs. Dupont had spread out sketches of the parlour's redesign, her pencil annotations meticulous. Miss Marple leaned closer, her eyes scanning the drawings. One sketch showed the rosewood table, but the lamp was absent, replaced by a modern vase. "You've planned for its absence," Miss Marple remarked, her tone mild. "Did you find it clashed with your design?" Mrs. Dupont hesitated, then laughed, a sound too sharp for the quiet room. "Not at all. I simply thought a vase would balance the space better. The lamp was overwhelming." She turned to a new swatch, her fingers fidgeting, a gesture Miss Marple noted with interest. The maid Ellen's account of seeing Mrs. Dupont in the parlour near 10 o'clock lingered in Miss Marple's mind. The decorator's claim of working late was plausible, but the hour was unusual. And her jumpiness, as Ellen described it, suggested more than a focus on curtains. Miss Marple thought of the scuff mark in the parlour, made by a narrow shoe. Mrs. Dupont's heels, elegant and pointed, could fit the description, though they were not as narrow as a man's dress shoe. Still, her access to the parlour and her knowledge of its contents made her a compelling figure in the mystery. "Such a responsibility," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking softly. "Handling a house full of treasures. I imagine you've seen many fine pieces in your work. Ever tempted to collect them yourself?" Mrs. Dupont's laugh was genuine this time, but it carried a nervous edge. "Collect? Oh no, Miss Marple. My passion is for creating spaces, not hoarding objects. Besides, my budget hardly allows for antiques." She turned away, busying herself with a roll of fabric, but her shoulders were tense, as if expecting further probing. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to motive. Mrs. Dupont's business was new, her reputation fragile. A single misstep could ruin her, but a bold move, like acquiring a rare piece to impress a wealthy client, could elevate her status. The lamp, with its unique craftsmanship, would be a prize for any decorator seeking to make a name. Yet the theft's precision, the undisturbed dust, the locked door, required a cool head, and Mrs. Dupont's fidgeting suggested nerves rather than calculation. "Last night must have been tiring," Miss Marple said, her tone sympathetic. "Working so late, all alone. Did you see anyone else about? Mr. Trent, perhaps? Or Mr. Voss? They seem such night owls." Mrs. Dupont shook her head, her chignon loosening slightly as she did. "No one, I'm afraid. The house was quiet. I finished my measurements and went to bed." Her voice was firm, but her eyes darted to the door, as if wary of being overheard. Miss Marple smiled, her mind cataloguing the response. An alibi, but one unverified, like Mr. Trent's claim of early retirement. She recalled a St. Mary Mead seamstress who swore she'd been home all evening, only for a neighbour to recall her silhouette in a shop window at midnight. Mrs. Dupont's presence in the parlour placed her near the scene of the crime, but the lock, the scuff mark and the lamp's careful removal pointed to a plan she might not have the composure to execute. As they discussed the merits of chintz versus silk, Miss Marple's thoughts wandered to the other suspects. Mr. Trent's debts and nervous charm suggested desperation, but his carelessness did not match the theft's meticulous nature. Mr. Grayson's tension and key made him a possibility, yet his loyalty seemed unshakable. Mr. Voss's obsession with antiques was compelling, but his fervour might make him reckless, not precise. Mrs. Dupont, with her access and ambition, fit the puzzle, but the pieces were not yet complete. "Thank you, Mrs. Dupont," Miss Marple said, rising from her chair. "You've been most helpful. I'll leave you to your work. It's quite splendid." She smiled, her eyes twinkling with a warmth that masked her scrutiny. Mrs. Dupont returned the smile, but it was tight, her fingers clutching the fabric swatch as if it were an anchor. Miss Marple left the drawing-room, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, her mind alive with questions. Mrs. Dupont's motive was clear, her opportunity undeniable, but her nerves suggested fear rather than guilt. The parlour's secrets, the scuff mark, the dust, the lock, whispered of a thief with steady hands, and Miss Marple was not yet certain those hands were Mrs. Dupont's. She resolved to speak to Mr. Voss next, his passion for antiques a thread that demanded closer inspection. As she stepped into the hall, the Manor's grandeur seemed to close around her, its secrets waiting to be unravelled by her patient, unerring touch. Chapter 6. The Collector's Passion. The library of Haverford Manor was a sanctuary of dark wood and leather-bound volumes, its air heavy with the scent of old paper and polish. Shelves stretched to the ceiling, laden with tomes on history, art, and antiquities, their spines glinting in the muted light that filtered through leaded windows. Mr. Reginald Voss, the collector, stood at a table strewn with sketches and catalogues, his thin frame bent over a small bronze statue, his pince-nez glasses slipping as he polished it with a reverence bordering on devotion. Miss Jane Marple, who had entered under the pretext of borrowing a book, stood nearby, her knitting bag at her side, her eyes as sharp as the needles within it. The theft of the antique lamp had tightened the web of suspicion around the Manor's guests, and Voss, with his fervent admiration for the missing piece was a thread Miss Marple was eager to follow. She approached, her steps soft on the thick Aubusson carpet, and offered a smile as disarming as a village vicar's. "Mr. Voss," she said, her voice gentle, "what a fascinating collection you have. This statue, is it Roman?" Voss's head snapped up, his eyes alight with enthusiasm. "Not Roman, Miss Marple, but Etruscan. 3rd century B.C., a rare find. The craftsmanship—" He paused, catching himself, and adjusted his glasses with a trembling hand. "But you're not here for my trinkets, I suppose. Lady Beatrice mentioned your inquiring about the lamp." His tone was polite, but a flicker of wariness crossed his face, like a shadow passing over a sunlit lawn. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of mild curiosity. "Oh, I'm merely an old woman with a knack for noticing things. The lamp was quite remarkable, wasn't it? You spoke so knowledgeably about it at dinner. French, you said, late Victorian." She settled into a chair, her knitting emerging as if by habit, the needles clicking softly. Voss's face softened, his passion overriding his caution. "Indeed, French, likely from the atelier of Émile Gallet. The glasswork, those sapphire and emerald hues, was exquisite, a masterpiece of its time, worth a small fortune to the right collector." His voice grew fervent, his hands gesturing as if conjuring the lamp before them. It belonged in a museum, not a parlour, where it could be truly appreciated. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on her knitting, but her attention on his fervour. In St. Mary Mead, she had known a recluse who hoarded rare stamps, not for their value, but for the thrill of possession, locking them away from the world. Voss's intensity was similar, a fire that burned too brightly to be mere scholarly interest. "You must have quite a collection yourself," she said. "Do you often acquire such pieces?" He hesitated, his fingers tightening around the bronze statue. "When I can," he said carefully. "My means are modest, but I seek quality over quantity. Each piece tells a story, you see." His eyes gleamed, and Miss Marple noted the way he avoided mentioning the lamp's disappearance, as if it were a wound too fresh to touch. She recalled the tilted book in the parlour, a treatise on French glasswork, and wondered if Voss had been studying it, perhaps planning his move. The scuff mark by the rosewood table, made by a narrow shoe, could match his loafers, which she had noticed at breakfast, polished but worn, the soles thin from years of Payson auction houses. His knowledge of locks, mentioned casually at dinner as a youthful skill learned from a locksmith uncle, added another layer. Could he have picked the parlour's lock, driven by a desire to possess the lamp? "You retired early last night, I believe?" she asked, her tone as casual as if discussing the weather. "After such a lively dinner, I thought you might have stayed up, perhaps admiring the Manor's treasures." Voss's smile was tight, his glasses slipping again. "Early, yes. I find late nights taxing. I was in my room by 10, reading." He gestured to a stack of books on the table, but his hand shook slightly, betraying his nerves. Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes meeting his for a moment. "Reading about glasswork, perhaps? I noticed a book in the parlour, slightly askew. It seemed just your sort of thing." His face paled, the statue nearly slipping from his grasp. "A book? I don't recall. I rarely visit the parlour after hours." He busied himself with the statue, polishing it with renewed vigour, but his movements were jerky, lacking their earlier reverence. Miss Marple smiled, her mind cataloguing his reaction. His passion for the lamp was undeniable, his discomfort palpable. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead widow, who collected porcelain figurines, her obsession leading her to borrow one from a neighbour's mantel, her guilt betrayed by a stammer. Voss's unease was subtler, but no less telling. Had he lingered in the parlour, unable to resist the lamp's allure? His alibi, like Mr. Trent's and Mrs. Dupont's, was unverified, a claim that hung on his word alone. She rose, smoothing her skirt. "You've given me much to think about, Mr. Voss," she said. "Your knowledge is quite inspiring. I must see more of your collection before I leave." Her tone was warm, but her eyes were sharp, noting the way he relaxed slightly, as if relieved by her departure. As she left the library, Miss Marple's thoughts churned. Voss's passion was a motive, his skill with locks and opportunity. The scuff mark, the tilted book, the careful theft, all pointed to someone with his expertise and desire. Yet his nervousness suggested fear, not just of discovery, but of losing something he coveted. In her village, a stolen painting had been found in a gardener's shed, kept not for sale, but for private adoration. Was Voss such a man, driven to possess the lamp for himself? She paused in the hall, her knitting bag a comforting weight at her side. The suspects were like pieces of a quilt, each distinct yet part of a larger pattern. Mr. Trent's debts, Mrs. Dupont's ambition, Mr. Grayson's tension, and now Voss's obsession. Each held a clue, but none yet formed the whole picture. The parlour's secrets, with its scuff mark and locked door, whispered of a thief with knowledge and care, and Voss's fervour made him a compelling fit. She resolved to revisit the parlour, perhaps to find another overlooked detail, and to speak with the maids again, who might have seen Voss moving about last night. As she stepped into the sunlight, Miss Marple felt the puzzle tightening, its threads drawing closer to the truth. Chapter 7. A clue in the dust. The late afternoon light filtered through the parlour's tall windows, casting long shadows across the Persian rug, and bathing the room in a golden haze. Miss Jane Marple stood alone in the now familiar space, her eyes tracing the contours of the rosewood table where the antique lamp had once stood, its absence as stark as a missing note in a familiar tune. The manor buzzed with the subdued activity of a household recovering from the morning's shock. But here, in the locked parlour, time seemed to pause, preserving the secrets of the theft. Miss Marple had returned to the scene, driven by a sense that the room held more to reveal, some overlooked detail that would illuminate the path to the truth. Her knitting bag rested on a chair, its contents untouched for now, as her hands and mind were occupied with the task of unravelling the mystery. She had spent the day observing the suspects: Mr. Trent's nervous charm, Mrs. Dupont's guarded ambition, Mr. Voss's fervent obsession, and Mr. Grayson's strained loyalty, each adding a thread to the tapestry of suspicion. Yet the parlour itself was the key, its locked door and undisturbed windows a puzzle that demanded solving. The scuff mark on the floor, noticed earlier, had pointed to a careful thief, but it was not enough to name the culprit. Miss Marple's experience in St. Mary Mead had taught her that the smallest clues, a smudged glass, a misplaced hairpin, often held the greatest weight, and she was determined to find such a clue here. She began with the rosewood table, its surface gleaming under the chandelier's light. The faint ring of dust where the lamp's base had rested was still visible, undisturbed by smears or fingerprints, a testament to the thief's precision. Miss Marple leaned closer, her eyes narrowing as she noticed something new. A subtle disruption in the dust, not a smudge, but a series of tiny circular impressions, as if the lamp had been lifted straight up and then set down briefly before being removed entirely. The marks were faint, almost invisible to a casual glance, but to Miss Marple they were as telling as a shout in a quiet room. The thief had hesitated, perhaps testing the lamp's weight or ensuring a secure grip, a sign of someone who knew its value and fragility. She straightened, her mind turning over the implications. A hasty thief, Mr. Trent perhaps driven by desperation, might have grabbed the lamp and left chaos in its wake. These marks suggested deliberation, a quality more aligned with Mr. Voss's obsession or Mrs. Dupont's meticulous nature than with Trent's recklessness. Mr. Grayson, with his butler's discipline, could also manage such care, but his broad shoes did not match the narrow scuff mark. Miss Marple filed the observation away, her thoughts as orderly as the stitches in her knitting. Moving to the carpet, she knelt with some effort, her fingers brushing the pile near the table. Her eyes caught a glint, a tiny shard of coloured glass, no larger than a grain of rice, nestled in the fibres. It shimmered with a faint sapphire hue, unmistakably matching the lamp's stained glass shade. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. She extracted a handkerchief from her sleeve and carefully lifted the shard, holding it to the light. It was chipped, its edge jagged, suggesting it had broken off during the theft, perhaps when the lamp was lifted or moved. Yet the table showed no other fragments, and the theft's precision argued against carelessness. Was the shard a genuine clue, or had it been placed to mislead? She pocketed the handkerchief, her mind racing. In St. Mary Mead, a broken teacup had once revealed a thief's identity, its fragments scattered by a nervous hand. Here the shard was solitary, deliberate, as if the thief had not noticed its loss. Mr. Voss, with his knowledge of glasswork, would have been careful, but his passion might have blinded him to such a detail. Mrs. Dupont, accustomed to handling delicate fabrics, might have overlooked a tiny chip. Mr. Trent, less likely, might have been too rushed to notice. Mr. Grayson, with his meticulous nature, seemed least likely to leave such evidence, but his unease suggested secrets of his own. Miss Marple rose, her gaze sweeping the room anew. The tilted book on French glasswork noticed earlier remained askew, its presence a silent accusation. She approached the bookshelf, running a finger along the spine. The book was heavy, its pages filled with illustrations of stained glass lamps, one strikingly similar to Lady Beatrice's. Had someone consulted it before the theft, perhaps to confirm the lamp's value? Mr. Voss was the obvious candidate, but Mrs. Dupont, with her decorator's eye, might have studied it to justify her claim that the lamp clashed with her designs. The parlour's other furnishings offered little. The wing-back chair's cushions, slightly askew, suggested someone had sat there recently, perhaps watching the lamp or planning the theft. The curtains, heavy and undisturbed, hid no secrets. The fireplace, swept clean, held no ash or debris. Yet the room's very orderliness was a clue, its pristine state a testament to the thief's care. Miss Marple thought of a saint. Mary Mead burglary, where a stolen clock left no trace but a faint scratch on a mantel, revealing a thief who knew the house's routines. Here, the thief knew the parlour's lock, the lamp's weight, and the need for silence. She decided to test her findings with a servant's perspective, seeking out Ellen, the housemaid, who was polishing silver in the dining room. Ellen's rosy cheeks flushed as Miss Marple approached, her apron twisted in her hands. "Ellen, dear," Miss Marple said, her voice as soothing as a lullaby, "you've been so helpful about the parlour. Did you notice anything unusual when you cleaned it yesterday? A bit of glass, perhaps, or someone lingering?" Ellen's eyes widened, her hands pausing. "Glass, miss?" "No, I didn't see none. I swept the carpet myself before dinner, but—" She hesitated, glancing at the door. "I did see Mr. Voss near the parlour after dinner when I was fetching a tray. He was just standing there, looking at the door like he was waiting for something." Miss Marple's needles, retrieved from her bag, clicked softly. "Waiting, you say? How curious. And no one else? Not that I saw, miss. Mrs. Dupont was there earlier, like I told you, measuring curtains. But Mr. Voss, he looked, I don't know, eager-like." Ellen's voice dropped, as if sharing a village secret. Miss Marple thanked her, her mind weaving the new information into the pattern. Voss's presence near the parlour, combined with the glass shard and the dust marks, strengthened his place in the web of suspicion. Yet Mrs. Dupont's late-night work, Mr. Trent's debts, and Mr. Grayson's tension remained threads to be explored. The shard was a tangible clue, but its meaning was unclear. Evidence of carelessness or a deliberate distraction. She recalled a St. Mary Mead case, where a dropped button had been planted to mislead, only to reveal the true thief's identity through its stitching. As she left the dining room, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the suspect's motives. Trent's desperation might lead to a hasty theft, but not the precision of the dust marks. Dupont's ambition could drive her to take the lamp for profit, but her nerves suggested caution, not daring. Grayson's loyalty was strained, but his role as butler made such a risk unlikely. Voss, with his collector's passion, seemed the closest fit, his obsession of fire that could burn through caution. Yet the shard, the scuff mark, the locked door, all required a steady hand, and Voss's trembling fingers suggested a man on edge. She resolved to observe the suspects at dinner, where their reactions to the lamp's absence might reveal more. The parlour's secrets were speaking, their whispers growing louder, and Miss Marple, with her patient, unerring touch, was determined to listen. As she stepped into the hall, her knitting bag swinging lightly, she felt the puzzle tightening, its pieces inching toward a truth that lay just beyond her grasp. Chapter 8. The Butler's Burden. The butler's pantry at Haverford Manor was a small, orderly kingdom. Its shelves lined with silver trays, crystal decanters, and neatly stacked linens, all gleaming under the soft glow of a single lamp. The air carried the faint tang of polish and the musty undertone of old wood. A fitting backdrop for Mr. Harold Grayson, who stood at a narrow table, his hands moving with mechanical precision as he polished a set of candlesticks. His black suit was immaculate, his grey hair combed with military exactness, but the lines etched into his face spoke of a weariness that went beyond the demands of his duties. Miss Jane Marple, standing in the doorway with her knitting bag tucked under her arm, observed him quietly, her presence as unobtrusive as a shadow. The theft of the antique lamp had tightened the web of suspicion around the manor, and Grayson, as keeper of the parlour key, was a figure central to the mystery. Miss Marple had chosen her moment carefully, waiting until the household was occupied with preparations for dinner when Grayson would be alone. She had spent the day gathering threads, Mr. Trent's nervous charm, Mrs. Dupont's guarded ambition, Mr. Voss's fervent obsession, and now the tiny shard of sapphire glass and the circular dust marks in the parlour, clues that pointed to a meticulous thief. Grayson's role as butler gave him unique access, but his rigid propriety and 30 years of service to Lady Beatrice suggested loyalty, not betrayal. Yet his curtness, noted by the maids, and his fleeting moments of unease hinted at a burden that Miss Marple was determined to explore. "Good evening, Mr. Grayson," she said, her voice as gentle as a summer breeze, stepping into the pantry with a smile that invited confidence. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. Such beautiful silver. Lady Beatrice is fortunate to have someone so dedicated to its care." Grayson's hands paused, the candlestick glinting in his grasp. "Thank you, miss," he replied, his tone formal but tinged with caution. "It's my duty to keep things in order." Resumed polishing, but his movements were slightly stiffer, as if her presence had set him on edge. Miss Marple settled onto a wooden stool, her knitting emerging as if by habit, the needles clicking softly in the quiet room. A trying day, with the lamp's disappearance, she said, her eyes on her work but her attention on his face. "It must be a weight on you, being responsible for the parlour's security." Grayson's jaw tightened, a flicker of strain crossing his features. "A great loss, miss. I locked the parlour at midnight, as always. The lamp was there. I checked it myself." His voice was steady, but his fingers gripped the candlestick a fraction too tightly, a detail Miss Marple noted with interest. In St. Mary Mead, she had known a postmaster whose loyalty to the village was unquestioned, yet who had once sold a neighbour's parcel to pay for a sick wife's medicine, his guilt betrayed by a trembling hand. Grayson's tension was similar, a crack in his polished facade. She recalled the footman's whisper at breakfast, mentioning Grayson's ill sister, whose treatment was costly. Could such a burden bend even a butler's ironclad duty? "You've served Lady Beatrice for many years, haven't you?" she said, her tone sympathetic. "It must be a comfort to her, knowing she can rely on you, though I imagine it's not without its pressures, especially in times like these." Grayson's eyes met hers briefly, then returned to the candlestick. 30 years, miss." "I do my best to keep the house running smoothly. Her ladyship deserves no less." His words were measured, but there was a weariness in them, as if the weight of those years pressed heavily. Miss Marple's needles clicked, her mind weaving the clues together. The parlour's scuff mark made by a narrow shoe did not match Grayson's sturdy boots, which she had observed at breakfast, their soles broad and practical for a man on his feet all day. The dust marks on the table, circular and precise, and the sapphire glass shard suggested a thief with care and knowledge, qualities Grayson possessed, but his role as butler made a blatant theft risky. The key, however, was a tantalizing thread. If he had unlocked the parlour for another, knowingly or not, it could explain the lack of forced entry. "Last night," she said, her voice as mild as if discussing the weather, "you checked the parlour at midnight, you say? Did you notice anything unusual? A sound, perhaps, or someone about the house?" Grayson shook his head, setting the candlestick down with a faint clink. "Nothing, miss. The house was quiet. I locked the door and went to my quarters." His tone was firm, but his fingers twitched, brushing against his waistcoat pocket where the key resided, a gesture Miss Marple noted with care. She thought of the scuff mark, the glass shard, the tilted book on French glasswork. Grayson's access to the parlour made him a conduit, if not the thief. Could he have been persuaded or coerced to leave the door unlocked? In her village, a trusted gardener had once left a gate unlatched for a friend, unaware it would lead to a theft, his guilt revealed by a stammer. Grayson's composure was stronger, but his unease was palpable. "I suppose the maids help with the parlour's cleaning," she said, changing tack. "They must rely on your guidance, with so many treasures to protect. That scuff mark on the floor, near the table, such a small thing, but it caught my eye. Not your doing, I'm sure." Grayson's face remained impassive, but his eyes flicked to hers, a spark of alarm quickly masked. "A scuff mark, miss. The maids should have seen to it. I'll speak to them." His voice was calm, but his hand lingered on the table, steadying himself. Miss Marple smiled, her expression as gentle as a grandmother's. "Oh, no need to trouble them. These things happen in a busy house. You've enough to manage, I'm sure." She paused, her needles still. "Though it's odd, isn't it? A locked room, a missing lamp, and no sign of a break-in, almost as if the thief knew the house as well as you do. Grayson's lips pressed into a thin line, his polishing cloth twisting in his hands. "I wouldn't know, miss. I do my duty, nothing more." His tone was clipped, a barrier against further probing. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. "Of course, Mr. Grayson. You're a credit to Lady Beatrice. I'll leave you to your work." She thanked him and stepped into the hall, her mind alive with possibilities. Grayson's burden was clear. Loyalty strained by personal troubles, perhaps a sister's illness, perhaps something deeper. Yet the scuff mark, the dust marks, and the glass shard pointed to a thief with narrower shoes and a collector's care, qualities more aligned with Mr. Voss, or even Mrs. Dupont, than with Grayson's practical demeanour. As she walked toward the drawing room, where the guests were gathering for pre-dinner drinks, Miss Marple reflected on the suspects. Mr. Trent's debts suggested desperation, but his recklessness did not match the theft's precision. Mrs. Dupont's ambition and late-night presence were compelling, but her nerves hinted at caution, not daring. Mr. Voss's obsession with antiques burned brightly, his knowledge of locks a key to the parlour's door. Grayson, with his key and his strain, was a figure of access, but not necessarily of guilt. The glass shard tucked in her handkerchief was a tangible clue, its sapphire glint a whisper of the lamp's fate. Was it a slip by the thief, or a deliberate misdirection? She resolved to watch Grayson at dinner, where his interactions with the others might reveal more. The parlour's secrets, the scuff mark, the dust, the shard, were pieces of a puzzle that grew clearer with each step. In St. Mary Mead, a stolen locket had been traced through a servant's unguarded moment, a glance that betrayed complicity. Here, the truth lay in such moments. And Miss Marple, with her patient, unerring touch, was determined to find them. As she entered the drawing-room, her knitting bag a comforting weight, she felt the web of suspicion tightening, its threads drawing her closer to the heart of the mystery. Chapter 9. The Dinner Party. The dining room of Haverford Manor glowed under the soft flicker of candlelight, its long mahogany table set with gleaming silver and crystal that sparkled like stars against the damask cloth. The air was rich with the aroma of roasted pheasant and spiced wine, a feast orchestrated by Lady Beatrice to maintain the facade of normalcy, despite the shadow cast by the missing antique lamp. The guests, seated in a careful arrangement of precedence and tact, conversed with the forced gaiety of a gathering aware of its own unease. Miss Jane Marple, positioned near the foot of the table, her modest tweed dress a contrast to the silks and velvets around her, appeared absorbed in her soup, but her clear blue eyes missed nothing. The dinner party was a stage, and its players, Mr. Trent, Mrs. Dupont, Mr. Voss, and Mr. Grayson, were performing, their words and gestures revealing more than they intended. Lady Beatrice, at the head of the table, presided with a brittle smile, her voice bright as she steered the conversation toward the weather and the upcoming hunt. Yet her eyes darted to the empty space in the parlour, visible through the open doors, where the rosewood table stood bereft of its treasure. Miss Marple, sipping her soup, noted the strain in her hostess's posture, a reminder of the urgency behind her quiet investigation. The clues, the scuff mark, the sapphire glass shard, the circular dust marks pointed to a meticulous thief. And tonight she hoped to coax more from the suspect's unguarded moments. Mr. Lionel Trent, seated across from her, was in fine form. His boyish charm turned up like a gas lamp. His linen suit was crisp, but the chipped cufflink gleamed in the candlelight, a small flaw in his polished facade. He regaled the novelist to his left with a tale of a Monte Carlo casino, his laughter loud but his eyes restless, flicking toward Lady Beatrice whenever the lamp was mentioned. "Such a fuss over a bit of glass," he said, waving a hand. "Beatrice, you've dozens of treasures. Surely one lamp won't be missed." His tone was teasing, but Miss Marple caught the edge in it, a deflection that hinted at discomfort. Mrs. Clara Dupont, to Trent's right, was quieter, her auburn hair catching the light as she rearranged her napkin with obsessive care. Her silk blouse, a soft green, complemented her eyes, but those eyes were guarded, avoiding the parlour's doorway. When Lady Beatrice mentioned the lamp's craftsmanship, Mrs. Dupont's spoon paused mid-air, her lips tightening. "It was distinctive," she said, her voice measured, but perhaps too bold for the room's new look. She resumed eating, but her fingers twisted the napkin, a nervous tick that Miss Marple noted with interest. Mr. Reginald Voss, seated near the centre, was a whirlwind of enthusiasm, his pince-nez glasses slipping as he leaned forward to describe a recent auction in Bath. "A chandelier, Murano glass, 17th century," he exclaimed, his hands gesturing wildly, nearly upsetting his wine. "Nothing like your lamp, Lady Beatrice, but a marvel nonetheless." His voice trembled with passion, but when the lamp was mentioned directly, his fork froze, his face paling slightly before he recovered with a cough. Miss Marple's needles, resting in her lap, clicked softly, her mind cataloguing his reaction. In St. Mary Mead, a collector of rare coins had once betrayed his theft with a similar pause, his obsession outweighing his caution. Mr. Grayson moved silently around the table, serving with the precision of a metronome, his black suit blending into the shadows. His face was impassive, but Miss Marple noticed his eyes linger on the guests, particularly Voss, whose animated gestures seemed to draw his attention. When he poured wine for Trent, his hand was steady, but a faint tremor betrayed him as he passed Mrs. Dupont, her napkin twisting, unnoticed by all but Miss Marple. Grayson's burden, hinted at by the footman's talk of his ill sister, was a thread she could not ignore. To test the waters, Miss Marple dropped a casual remark into a lull in the conversation. "The lamp's glass was so unique," she said, her voice mild. "Those sapphire and emerald hues, almost like the shard I found in the parlour carpet today. A tiny chip, but unmistakable." She watched the table, her eyes darting from face to face. Trent's laugh was immediate, too loud. "A shard? Probably from one of Beatrice's old vases. This house is full of fragile things." His fingers brushed his cufflink, the chipped edge catching the light. Mrs. Dupont's napkin twisted tighter, her knuckles whitening. "A shard?" she echoed, her voice sharp. "I didn't notice anything when I was measuring the curtains. The carpet was clean." Her eyes met Miss Marple's, then dropped quickly, a flush creeping up her neck. Voss's fork clattered against his plate, a sound that echoed in the sudden silence. "A chip of glass," he said, adjusting his glasses with a trembling hand. "How careless of someone. The lamp was flawless, wasn't it?" His voice was strained, his enthusiasm dimmed, and Miss Marple noted the sweat beading on his brow. Grayson, refilling a water glass, paused briefly, his face unreadable, but his posture rigid. "The maids sweep daily, miss," he said, his tone even. "I'll ensure they're more thorough." His eyes avoided hers, focusing instead on the table, a detail that spoke volumes to Miss Marple's practised eye. The conversation resumed, steered by Lady Beatrice to safer topics, but the atmosphere had shifted, the air charged with unspoken questions. Miss Marple sipped her wine, her mind weaving the reactions into the pattern of clues. The shard, now safe in her handkerchief, was a catalyst, its mention drawing out fear, deflection, and denial. Trent's dismissal was too quick. His nonchalance, a mask for nerves. Mrs. Dupont's defensiveness suggested knowledge, perhaps of the parlour's state. Voss's alarm was the most pronounced, his collector's passion making the shard a personal affront. Grayson's calm was practised, but his tremor betrayed a burden that went beyond duty. As the meal progressed, Miss Marple observed their interactions. Trent flirted with the novelist, but his glances toward Voss were sharp, as if gauging a rival. Mrs. Dupont spoke little, her eyes darting to the parlour door, her napkin now a crumpled knot. Voss, recovering his composure, launched into a monologue about Venetian glass, but his voice lacked its earlier fire, his hands restless. Grayson served with mechanical efficiency, but when he passed Miss Marple, his eyes met hers for a fleeting moment, a silent plea or warning she could not yet decipher. In St. Mary Mead, a stolen brooch had been traced through a dinner party's unguarded glances, a guest's flush revealing her guilt. Here, the dinner was a mirror, reflecting the suspect's fears. The scuff mark, the dust marks, the glass shard, all pointed to a thief with care and access. Trent's debts, Dupont's ambition, Voss's obsession, Grayson's strain, each was a motive, but the shard's presence suggested a mistake, a crack in the thief's plan. Was it Voss, his passion blinding him to a tiny chip? Or Dupont, her nerves betraying a careful act? Trent seemed too reckless, Grayson too loyal, but appearances, Miss Marple knew, could deceive. As dessert was served, Miss Marple resolved to press further, perhaps by examining the suspects' rooms or questioning the maids about their movements after dinner. The dinner party had revealed much, but the truth remained just out of reach, hidden in the shadows of the Manor's elegance. She smiled at Lady Beatrice, her knitting needles clicking softly, her mind as sharp as ever, ready to unravel the next thread in the mystery of the vanished lamp. Chapter 10. The Hidden Truth. The corridors of Haverford Manor were hushed in the late evening, the only sounds the distant clink of china from the servants' quarters, and the soft creak of floorboards under Miss Jane Marple's careful steps. The dinner party had dispersed, leaving behind a residue of tension that clung to the air like damp mist. Miss Marple, her knitting bag a familiar weight at her side, moved with purpose towards the guest wing, where Mr. Reginald Voss's rooms were located. The clues she had gathered, the scuff mark, the sapphire glass shard, the circular dust marks, and the suspect's reactions at dinner, had tightened the web of suspicion. And Voss, with his collector's passion and uneasy demeanour, was a thread she could no longer ignore. Tonight she sought a glimpse into his world, hoping to uncover the hidden truth behind the lamp's disappearance. Miss Marple had secured Lady Beatrice's permission for a discreet tour of Voss's rooms, under the pretext of admiring his collection of antiques. The request was innocent enough, and Lady Beatrice, still rattled by the theft, had agreed, trusting Miss Marple's quiet wisdom to avoid a scandal. Voss himself had hesitated when approached, his pince-nez glasses slipping as he stammered an agreement. But his enthusiasm for his treasures won out, as Miss Marple had anticipated. Now, as she knocked softly on his door, she prepared to observe not just his collection, but the man himself, whose fervour for the lamp had marked him as a prime suspect. The door opened, and Voss greeted her with a nervous smile, his thin frame dwarfed by the cluttered opulence of his rooms. The space was a treasure trove, its walls lined with sketches of artifacts, its tables crowded with vases, statuettes, and books on antiquities. A single lamp cast a warm glow, illuminating a glass-fronted cabinet that dominated one corner. "Welcome, Miss Marple," Voss said, his voice eager but strained. "I'm delighted to share my collection, though it's modest compared to Lady Beatrice's." His hands gestured expansively, but his eyes darted to the cabinet, a fleeting glance that Miss Marple noted with care. She smiled, her expression as gentle as a village spinster's. "How fascinating, Mr. Voss. You have such a passion for these things. I'm sure you could tell me stories about each piece." She moved toward a table, admiring a small jade figurine, her eyes subtly scanning the room. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and wax, but there was something else, a faint, almost imperceptible tang of something metallic, like glass freshly cut. Voss launched into a description of the figurine, his voice warming as he spoke of its Ming Dynasty origins. Miss Marple listened, her knitting needles clicking softly in her lap, but her attention was drawn to the cabinet. Its glass doors were locked, the key glinting in Voss's waistcoat pocket, but through a narrow crack between the panels, she glimpsed a shimmer of sapphire and emerald, a hue unmistakably like the missing lamp's shade. Her heart quickened, though her face remained serene, her needles maintaining their steady rhythm. "You mentioned the lamp at dinner," she said, her tone casual. "Such a remarkable piece. I wonder if you have anything similar in your collection, something with that same French glasswork." She tilted her head, her eyes meeting his with innocent curiosity. Voss's hand froze mid-gesture, his glasses slipping down his nose. "Similar? Oh no, Miss Marple. My pieces are different, mostly porcelain and bronze. Glass is so fragile, you know." He adjusted his glasses, his fingers trembling slightly, and turned to a shelf of books, as if to distract her. Her Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. The glimpse of coloured glass was no coincidence, but she needed more to confirm her suspicion. In St. Mary Mead, a stolen necklace had been found in a locked box, revealed by a maid's careless remark about a rattling sound. Here, the cabinet was the key, but she could not demand to open it without proof. She moved closer, pretending to admire a vase, her eyes scanning the cabinet's lock. It was sturdy, modern, unlike the parlour's Victorian mechanism, but Voss's skill with locks, mentioned in passing, suggested he could secure his treasures with ease. "Your collection must be a comfort," she said, her voice warm. "I knew a gentleman in my village who collected rare coins, kept them locked away to enjoy in private. He said it was like owning a piece of history." She paused, watching his reaction. Voss's smile was tight, his eyes flicking to the cabinet again. "Exactly so," he said, his voice a touch too eager. "To hold history in one's hands, it's a privilege." He moved to a table, offering to show her a sketch of a Roman urn, but his hands shook, betraying his nerves. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the clues. The scuff mark, made by a narrow shoe like Voss's loafers. The glass shard, matching the lamp's shade. The dust marks, indicating a careful lift. Voss's presence near the parlour, noted by Ellen, and his alarm at dinner when the shard was mentioned, painted a picture of a man consumed by desire. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead widow, who hid stolen trinkets in her attic, her obsession blinding her to morality. Voss's passion was similar, a fire that could drive him to pick a lock and claim the lamp for his private hoard. She thanked him, her smile disarming, and excused herself, promising to return for another look at his collection. As she left, she spoke to Lady Beatrice, suggesting a discreet search of Voss's rooms, framing it as a precaution to ensure no other treasures were at risk. Lady Beatrice, pale but resolute, agreed, and with Grayson's assistance, the cabinet was opened later that evening, when Voss was occupied with a card game in the library. Inside, nestled among porcelain and bronze, was the lamp, its sapphire and emerald shade intact, save for a tiny chip, matching the shard in Miss Marple's handkerchief. The discovery was a triumph, but Miss Marple's work was not done. The lamp's presence confirmed Voss's guilt, but the how and why required confrontation. She returned to her room, her knitting resuming as she planned the final act. The parlour's secrets, the scuff mark, the shard, the dust, had led her here, and Voss's obsession, revealed in his trembling hands and furtive glances, was the key. She resolved to gather the suspects tomorrow, to lay out the truth in the parlour where the crime began, as she had done in St. Mary Mead, when a stolen locket was traced to a vicar's study. As she knitted, the pattern of the crime became clear. Voss, driven by a collector's mania, had picked the parlour lock, his narrow shoes leaving the scuff mark, his careful hands lifting the lamp, a chip of glass falling unnoticed. His alibi, like the others, was a fragile thread, unravelled by the maid's observations and the cabinet's contents. Miss Marple's needles clicked, her mind as sharp as ever, ready to weave the final threads of the mystery into a tapestry of truth. Chapter 11. The Confession. The parlour of Haverford Manor, restored to its former elegance with the return of the antique lamp, glowed softly in the late morning light, its sapphire and emerald shade casting delicate patterns across the Persian rug. The rosewood table, once bereft, now held its treasure proudly, though a faint chip in the glass shade whispered of the recent turmoil. Miss Jane Marple stood near the table, her modest tweed dress blending into the room's opulence, her knitting bag resting on a nearby chair. The household had gathered at her request, summoned by Lady Beatrice, who sat at the head of the room, her face a mixture of relief and apprehension. The suspects, Mr. Lionel Trent, Mrs. Clara Dupont, Mr. Reginald Voss, and Mr. Harold Grayson, stood or sat in a semicircle, their expressions ranging from curiosity to unease. The air was thick with anticipation, as if the parlour itself awaited the unveiling of its secrets. Miss Marple's clear blue eyes swept the room, her demeanour as calm as a saint. Mary Mead afternoon, though her mind was a whirl of precision, weaving together the clues that had led to this moment. The scuff mark on the floor, the sapphire glass shard, the circular dust marks, the tilted book, and the lamp's discovery in Voss's locked cabinet had formed a pattern, one she was now ready to reveal. In her village, she had unmasked a thief at a church fete, her quiet words exposing a pilfered brooch through a trail of overlooked details. Here, the stakes were higher, but the method was the same: observation, patience, and the truth hidden in human nature. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice gentle but firm, carrying the authority of one who saw more than she let on. "Lady Beatrice has suffered a great loss, but the lamp, as you see, has been returned. Yet the question remains, who took it, and why?" She paused, letting her words settle, her eyes noting each reaction. Mr. Trent leaned against a chair, his boyish grin strained, his chipped cufflink glinting as he crossed his arms. "A bit dramatic, Miss Marple," he said, his tone light, but his eyes darting to the lamp. "It's back, isn't it? No harm done." Mrs. Dupont, seated with her hands clasped tightly, her auburn hair catching the light, said nothing, but her green eyes flicked to the lamp, then to Miss Marple, a flush creeping up her neck. Mr. Grayson stood by the door, his butler's composure intact, though his fingers brushed his waistcoat pocket, where the parlour key resided. Mr. Voss, his pince-nez glasses slipping, sat rigidly, his thin frame tense, his hands gripping the arms of his chair as if to anchor himself. Miss Marple smiled, her expression disarming. No harm, perhaps, but a theft is no small matter. The parlour was locked, the windows secure, yet the lamp vanished. It required skill, care, and knowledge of the house. She stepped toward the rosewood table, her hand resting lightly on its edge. The clues were subtle, but they spoke clearly. A scuff mark on the floor, made by a narrow shoe. A shard of sapphire glass in the carpet, chipped from the lamp's shade. Dust on the table, disturbed in a circular pattern, as if the lamp was lifted with precision. She paused, her eyes moving to Voss, whose face paled, his glasses slipping further. These clues pointed to someone with access, motive, and a particular skill. The parlour's lock was not forced, suggesting a key, or the ability to pick it. She turned to Grayson, her tone gentle. "Mr. Grayson, you hold the key, and your loyalty to Lady Beatrice is unquestioned. Yet your strain, perhaps from personal troubles, raised questions. A sister's illness, I understand, can be a heavy burden." Grayson's face tightened, but he nodded. "My sister is ill, miss, but I'd never betray her ladyship. The parlour was locked at midnight, the lamp in place." His voice was steady, but his eyes held a flicker of gratitude for her tact. Miss Marple nodded, turning to Trent. "Mr. Trent, your charm is undeniable, but debts can drive a man to desperate acts. Your shoes matched the scuff mark's size, and your late-night habits suggested opportunity. Yet your recklessness, a chipped cufflink, an ink-stained finger, did not fit the theft's care." Trent's grin faltered, his hand brushing the cufflink, but he remained silent. She moved to Mrs. Dupont, whose hands twisted together. "Mrs. Dupont, your work gave you access to the parlour, and your ambition is clear. You were there late, measuring curtains, a perfect cover. But your nerves or your hesitation when the shard was mentioned suggested fear, not guilt." Mrs. Dupont's flush deepened, her lips parting, but no words came. Finally, Miss Marple's gaze settled on Voss, whose knuckles whitened on the chair. "Mr. Voss, your passion for antiques is a fire that burns brightly. You spoke of the lamp with reverence, your knowledge of its French glasswork unmatched. You were seen near the parlour after dinner, and your skill with locks, learned in youth, gave you means. The scuff mark matches your loafers. The shard matches the chip in the lamp's shade, found in your cabinet." She produced the handkerchief, unfolding it to reveal the sapphire fragment, its glint a silent accusation. Voss's face crumpled, his glasses falling to his lap. I didn't mean harm," he whispered, his voice breaking. "It was too perfect, too rare. I couldn't let it stay here, unseen, unappreciated. I only wanted to study it, to keep it safe in my collection." The room fell silent, the weight of his confession settling like dust. Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her resolve was firm. Obsession, Mr. Voss, can blind even the keenest mind. You picked the lock, lifted the lamp with care, but left a shard and a scuff mark. Your passion betrayed you. She turned to Lady Beatrice, whose face was a mix of shock and relief. The lamp is restored, and the truth is known. In St. Mary Mead, a stolen painting had been returned after a similar confession. The thief's remorse softening the village's judgment. Here, Voss's fate would be decided by Lady Beatrice, but Miss Marple's task was complete. The parlour's secrets, the scuff mark, the shard, the dust, had led her to the truth, as they always did, through the quiet art of observation. Chapter 12. The Resolution. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Haverford Manor's parlour, bathing the room in a golden glow that set the antique lamp's sapphire and emerald shade alight, its colours dancing across the polished rosewood table. The lamp, restored to its rightful place after its brief exile in Mr. Voss's locked cabinet, stood as a silent testament to the truth uncovered by Miss Jane Marple's quiet persistence. The household, though still shaken by the events of the previous day, had begun to settle, the air lighter now that the mystery was resolved. Miss Marple stood by the table, her tweed dress as unassuming as ever, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, her clear blue eyes reflecting a satisfaction tempered by the melancholy of human frailty. The parlour, once a stage for deception, was now a place of clarity, its secrets laid bare. Lady Beatrice, seated in a high-backed chair, clasped Miss Marple's hands, her face a mixture of gratitude and relief. "Jane, you've saved us from a scandal," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "To think it was Mr. Voss, all along, driven by such madness. How did you know?" Her eyes, still shadowed by the ordeal, sought understanding, as if the theft had shaken her faith in her own judgment. Miss Marple smiled, her expression as gentle as a St. Mary Mead breeze. "It's only observation, Beatrice, and a little knowledge of people. They're much the same, you know, whether in a manor or a village, a scuff mark, a shard of glass, a moment's hesitation. These things tell a story, if one listens." She patted Lady Beatrice's hand, her modesty belying the sharpness that had unravelled the mystery. The events of the previous evening lingered in her mind. After Mr. Voss's confession, delivered in the parlour amid the stunned silence of the gathered suspects, he had been quietly escorted from the manor by 2 discreet constables, summoned by Lady Beatrice at Miss Marple's suggestion. His collection, housed in his rooms, was to be examined by authorities, lest other stolen treasures lay hidden among his bronzes, no, porcelains. Voss had gone without protest, his thin frame slumped, his pince-nez glasses clutched in his hand, as if the weight of his obsession had finally broken him. "I only wanted to keep it safe," he had murmured, his voice a whisper of regret, "to hold its beauty for myself." Miss Marple had seen such remorse before, in St. Mary Mead, where a young man who stole a silver candlestick from the church had wept upon its return, his guilt a heavier burden than his crime. Here, Voss's passion had been his undoing, his love for the lamp's craftsmanship blinding him to morality. The scuff mark from his narrow loafers, the sapphire shard chipped in his careful theft, the circular dust marks on the table, and the tilted book on French glasswork had formed a trail she could not ignore. His skill with locks, a relic of his youth, had given him access, but his trembling hands and fevered glances had betrayed him. The other suspects, cleared of guilt, had reacted with a mix of relief and unease. Mr. Lionel Trent, his boyish charm dimmed by the confrontation, had left the parlour with a forced laugh, his chipped cufflink a reminder of his own secrets, debts that, while not driving him to theft, had cast suspicion. Mrs. Clara Dupont, her auburn hair loosened from its chignon, had murmured apologies for her nerves, her ambition tempered by the realization of how close she had come to being accused. Mr. Harold Grayson, his butler's composure restored, had stood straighter, his loyalty vindicated, though Miss Marple suspected his sister's illness would continue to weigh on him. As Miss Marple prepared to depart Haverford Manor, her suitcase packed and her train to St. Mary Mead awaiting, she took a final walk through the gardens, the roses now fading in the late summer heat. Lady Beatrice accompanied her, her gratitude overflowing in offers of future visits and heartfelt thanks. "You've a gift, Jane," she said, pausing by a fountain. "I'd have called the police, made a fuss, and lost more than a lamp. You saw what we couldn't." Miss Marple shook her head, her knitting needles clicking softly in her bag. "It's no gift, Beatrice, only experience. People are like patterns, you see, repeating, predictable, if you know where to look." Mr. Voss's passion was his pattern, just as Mr. Trent's debts, Mrs. Dupont's ambition, and Mr. Grayson's loyalty were theirs. The lamp was merely the thread that tied them together. She smiled, her eyes twinkling with the quiet joy of a puzzle solved. The train station was a short drive away, and as Miss Marple boarded the carriage, her thoughts turned to St. Mary Mead. The village, with its gossip and small dramas, was a world away from the manor's grandeur, yet its lessons had served her here. The scuff mark, the shard, the dust marks, each a village clue in disguise, revealing a truth as universal as human nature. She thought of a stolen teapot in her youth, traced through a maid's nervous giggle and a missing letter that exposed a vicar's indiscretion. Haverford Manor was grander, but its secrets were no different. Its people driven by the same desires and fears. As the train pulled away, the manor's spires fading into the distance, Miss Marple opened her knitting bag, her needles resuming their familiar rhythm. The case of the vanished lamp was closed, but another puzzle would surely await in St. Mary Mead or beyond. People, she knew, would always reveal themselves, their secrets spilling like stitches from a dropped skein. She leaned back, her eyes half closed, a faint smile on her lips, ready for whatever mystery the world might bring next.